Welcome to the full story of Heretics of Dune. This book was first published in 1984, 3 years after God Emperor of Dune. It happens in the year 15,229 AG, 1,501 years after the fall of the God Emperor. By itself, God Emperor of Dune was already quite different from the first Dune trilogy. But it kept the focus on philosophy on the forefront. Starting with Heretics of Dune, though, things change a lot. Philosophy is still very important, but here we start getting a lot more details when it comes to fights and battles. You know, I like to joke how the final battle at the end of Dune was barely 2 pages long. Well, that's not something that will happen anymore. The edition of the book I'm reading for this video has an introduction by Frank Herbert, back when he was writing the original Dune. It took him 6 years of research to finally write the novel. The book was rejected by 12 publishers before someone finally accepted it. In truth, Frank had no worries for success nor failure. He just wanted to get his book finished and published. By the time Dune had been released and was becoming popular, Frank already had parts of both Dune Messiah and Children of Dune written and ready. So he shifted his focus on to write those 2 books and release them next. Frank was certainly one of the smartest men ever to live. And with that out of the way, let's get into this chapter of the story of Dune. The first chapter is quite expansive and we are introduced to a lot of information. Reverend Mother Shvang Yu is located at planet Gammu. She is responsible for the Bene Gesserit outpost there and has to oversee the project of a new Duncan Idaho Gola. This Gola is now 12 years old and the 12th of his production line. For the previous 11 Golas were all killed by Tleilaxu assassins, for some unknown reason which the Bene Gesserit are still investigating. Reverend Mother Lucilla was sent to Gammu to imprint this Duncan Gola, which is basically to reproduce with him to preserve his genes and make a strong emotional connection with him through sex. We see from the start that Shvang Yu is completely against this Gola project which her sisterhood is embarking. She's not alone, some other sisters are beside her with this idea. It is described that Shvang Yu is a short, old and unattractive woman, while Lucilla is described to be tall and curvy, with pronounced breasts and blue melange eyes. Her great genetics were passed forward, for Lucilla had given the Sisterhood 3 children by now. The current Bene Gesserit leader is Reverend Mother Superior Taraza, the one who had sent Lucilla to Gammu to imprint Duncan Idaho, and the one who warned her about how untrustworthy Shvang Yu was. This current sisterhood had a more monarchical hierarchy than ever before, and in these trying times, they had to be careful not to bring themselves to destruction. Since the death of the God Emperor, the sisterhood had gotten its genetic breeding program back, with a new goal being, instead of creating a Kvisitz Haderach, to prevent one from coming into existence. And the reason so many sisters were against the Idaho project was due to the fact that he could be potential Kvisitz Haderach. Thousands of mysterious groups had dispersed during the scattering. Those groups were now coming back to what is known as the Old Imperium. One of them called themselves as the Honored Matres. It is said that the Ixians had united with what was left of the fish speakers, and now both groups rule together in Ix. As Lucilla and Shvang Yu watch the young Gola training, the older sister mentions a girl called Sheeana from planet Rakis, a girl who had the power to control Sandworms. Part of their plan was to send Duncan, imprinted and trained under the Sisterhood and with his memories back, to Rakis, with the intention to control Sheeana with him. Along with Lucilla, there was a famous Bashar named Miles Teg. He was also sent to Gammu to oversee Duncan's protection. One of his men, Patron, was chief of security, and currently watching Duncan from a rooftop, while he was training and playing on an open square, just as the two Reverend Mothers were also watching the boy as they had a conversation. The first chapter ends by Lucilla remarking on how she looks very similar to another Reverend Mother, one called Darwi Odrade, the chief of Bene Gesserit security under Taraza. Both of them were descendants of the Atreides through Sheeana, after all. She thinks now, even with the God Emperor dead for longer than 1,500 years, his influence still haunts over the galaxy and shows no sign of getting away. From Duncan's perspective, there was Reverend Mother Shvang Yu and a new one he hadn't seen at Gammu before. He knew they were talking about him. Differently to the sisters, Idaho liked both Patrim and the Bashar Miles Teg, just as they also liked him as well. Miles Teg himself was not just the most important Bashar the Bene Gesserit ever had, but was also a Mentat. Teg had taught him a lot about history, military training, and about tactics. Teg was the one who taught him this training he's doing right now at the garden. Duncan had noticed how the new Reverend Mother, Lucilla, had no contact lens to hide her blue melange eyes, something most Reverend Mothers, such as Shvang Yu, use to hide their addiction. Lucilla was truly one of the few not afraid to show those eyes. Duncan knew that he was special. He's the reason Gammu is so protected by the Sisterhood and has all those satellites and no ships in orbit. No ships are like no rooms, invisible to the Oracle of Prescience. Gammu was once known as Giedi Prime, later renamed to Gammu by someone named Gurney Halleck, a long time ago, but it took time for the new name to catch on. The planet was a hellish industrial wasteland for most of its history, but many generations of plant growth turned it into a vast conifer forest planet. This section also describes how the Suck Doctors are now fully financed and controlled by the Bene Gesserit, and how they are important to fight against artificial bioweapons, diseases, and viruses. Once Idaho had the habit of escaping away from the fort to spend some time in nature. On one occasion, he was captured and Shvang Yu punished everyone in the fort just because of him. This was the beginning of Idaho's hatred of the Bene Gesserit. But there were a few sisters who weren't that bad, such as Reverend Mother Tamerlane, who was also a very old woman, and had taught him a lot. Tamerlane taught Duncan about the Bene Gesserit punishments, the worst ones ever known to humanity. Luran Jiaza used to be the librarian of Gammu Fort. She was responsible for teaching Duncan and for giving him access to their library. With her, Idaho had studied about the Tyrant, the God Emperor, and his fish speakers. Idaho wished he was alive during that time, being one of the few male commanders the fish speakers ever had throughout his reign. Little does he know, little does he know. Idaho studied about the Church of Shai Hulud, the divided God. Both the Bene Gesserit and Miles Teg had told him that the Church of the divided God was a joke of a religion for weak and pompous people. In the past, Fremen rode sandworms, but now this Rakian clergy completely prohibited that and executed anyone who dared to disrespect the sandworms in such a way. Idaho read the reports behind the discovery of Dar-es-Balat. The documents mentioned the 9 daughters of Sheeana Atreides and 1,000 sons of Duncan Idaho. Sheeana was a pure Atreides. Her descendants had the genetic trait of being invisible to the Oracle of Prescience. Such was how no rooms and no ships also did, while this man, Duncan Idaho, was a Gola. Young Idaho used ChatGPT and learned all about what a Gola is. I'm telling you, in 1984, Frank had also foreseen ChatGPT, but by the end of the video I'll have many things to tell you about this book, so let's keep it to that part of the video, but I digress. Golas were made of the cells of a dead body to create a copy of such person. This new body grew inside the axolotl tanks of the Bene Tleilax. Young Idaho soon realized that he was also a Gola, a Ghola of the man who had served the God Emperor for hundreds of years in many Ghola bodies. After this event, Shvang-Yu limited Idaho's access to the library and sent Ludon Gyasa away. She hadn't received the Sisterhood's training and had become far too attached emotionally to the boy. With this, Duncan, at 12 years of age, had become fully stoic and despised the Sisterhood as a whole, something Shvang-Yu was well aware. Time passed by. Duncan turned 15, although he didn't know the exact date of his birth. He felt like having memories of the past which he had no access to. One day, Duncan managed to escape the fort once more, through what he called the Forbidden Window. He went far away from Gammu Fort and saw the forests and mountains, before coming back. This time, nobody had noticed he had left. This was also part of his training. If Duncan was caught, people would be punished. For that reason, escape away as far as you want, but don't let anyone discover you did so. Upon being back, Duncan started having visions of a woman, believing her to be his mother. He knew the key was in his inaccessible memories. One day, Idaho learned about the Ixion probes, devices that could read minds of both living people and dead bodies. Shear was a drug which, once someone died, would dissolve the person's neurons to such a state which the Ixion probe was unable to read their memories. The Sisterhood also taught him about how religion was only a tool to be used to control people. By now, Duncan saw himself as being completely separate from the Bene Gesserit. They were his enemy. Shvang-Yu knew Lucilla and Miles would never join her against Taraza. She and the other traitors within the Bene Gesserit were the ones who feared the Kvisitz Haderach the most, but she kept neutral toward Duncan, for Lucilla had told Shvang-Yu to her face that she knew the older sister wanted to sabotage his training, and about how she was treacherous. Lucilla and Miles were watching her actions carefully. Valak 9 wasn't the Bene Gesserit center of operations for around 1,500 years by now, function which Chapter House currently held. Reverend Mother Superior Alma Mavis Taraza had a meeting with Dari Odrade over at Planet Chapter House. Taraza sat on a chair dog, a recent Tleilaxu invention, a chair which adapted to the mood and position of whoever sat on it and, by its name, was probably a genetic modification of a dog. Come to think about it, beside that one mention of the Hounds of the Red Abyss from Children of Dune and the D-Wolves from God Emperor of Dune, dogs are never mentioned in Dune up until the chair dogs become a component of the story. That's an interesting thought, and no, the pug from David Lynch's Dune doesn't count. Going back to their meeting, Taraza read Odrade's profile once more. Even though she was reading the document, Taraza had already memorized it by now. Odrade had given the Bene Gesserit 19 children, very remarkable, even for a sister of the Bene Gesserit. Meanwhile, Odrade thinks to herself about how Taraza was always good at reproducing with difficult nobles. Darwi wanted to meet Lucilla, but she was prevented from doing so. She had a personal theory that Lucilla was either a daughter of her or a sister, but none is ever confirmed. Taraza mentions how the number of conflicts in the Old Imperium has decreased to 2% in comparison to how it was before the rule of the tyrant. Yet, the statistics of the scattering were still unknown by the Bene Gesserit. There were too many aggressive and mysterious groups which had suddenly appeared back in the Old Imperium. Those had come back from the scattering space. Odrade recalls the memories of her childhood. Details documented in her profile. Her mother was a Bene Gesserit. As a child, Odrade was sent to live with a non-related family whom took good care of her until she was of age, to be taken and trained in the ways of the Sisterhood. Those closer to her within the sisters called Odrade as Dar. Still, she had many happy memories from her childhood in Gammu. The planet had been rebuilt by the people of Dan at the beginning of the scattering. Those people, now known as Dan, once lived in a planet called Caladan. It is left up in the air what had happened to Caladan. Maybe destroyed, who knows. Odrade's adoptive mother's name was Sibia, but since the Sisterhood had taken her away, she never saw Sibia ever again. In truth, Odrade missed her parents, just as they also must miss her. While at the Sisterhood school, Odrade was taught that those emotions were primitive and useless. Love only led to pain, she was taught. Once, a sister named Jessica let love control her decisions, and because of that, the Imperium lived 3,500 years under the tyrant. All of those warm and happy memories and emotions of her childhood were used against Odrade in her training. Whilst being taught to become a Bene Gesserit, Odrade met Taraza, and they became known as Dar and Tar, something they still call themselves up to this day. Odrade questions what's the real meaning of this new breeding program. Is it really to prevent a new Kvisit's Hadrach? It is revealed that the Bene Gesserit still exists today because Leto II, loyal to his own grandmother Jessica, decided not to kill all of the Sisterhood because of such loyalty. The meeting was over. Odrade would be sent to Rakis, but not just yet. Miles Teg was recalling back when he was ordered to join this mission for the Bene Gesserit. He was a Mentat with the same beliefs of the Sisterhood. He was loyal to them and had brought many victories to the Bene Gesserit. But now he had retired. Miles' height was over 2 meters and he was 296 years old. He was a man of old habits and despised living furniture and chair dogs. In his retirement, he moved back to his family farm. His mother was Janet Hawksbrew, of fish speaker and Atreides ancestry. She was a reverend mother for the Sisterhood, while his father was Loshi Teg, an official of the Chom Company. Miles had a brother, Sabine, who would die by poisoning later in life. It is never specified if it was an assassination or by accident, nor if Sabine became a military man like Miles. We just know that he died and that's all. Teg recalls his oldest memories. He remembers eating dinner with his family and his smaller brother. Janet was teaching Loshi how to deal with the face dancers and a Tleilaxu trader who wanted to buy his pungi rice. The couple had to work together to discover what were their true intentions in Lernaeus. Buying rice was most definitely not it. Loshi's meeting with the Tleilax happens. Miles and Janet were watching them through a visor when the face dancers came out to meet with his father. Janet taught her son how to identify face dancers. She tells him about how they are the face of evil. Face dancers were communal creatures. They had no personality and were unable to have children. But the newest specimens created by the Bene Tleilax had the ability to copy the memories of their victims. Few were the Tleilaxu masters, and nobody had ever seen one of them. In the end, the Tleilax bought Loshi's rice with melange coins. Miles had the potential of becoming a Mentat, one of the reasons the Sisterhood chose Loshi for Janet to marry. When at 13 years of age, Teg was sent to planet Lampadas to be trained in his Mentat abilities. Lampadas is the planet Mentat training is done, and has been since the Butlerian Jihad, halting during the reign of the Tyrant. Miles had the potential of a Mentat, but he had completely failed the prescience test, even though he had Atreides genes. The Tleilax had broken the Rakis melange monopoly. The Ixians had broken the Navigators Guild monopoly over space transport. The Chom was a relatively irrelevant company by now. The Bene Gesserit were still the strongest group in the old Imperium, the one holding it together. Taraza had visited Miles personally at Lernus, the planet his farm resided at. Teg was the perfect man for the job Taraza required, but he was a difficult man, especially for the Bene Gesserit sisters. Teg had Atreides genes. He looked exactly like Leto the First Atreides, and was perfect to awaken the Duncan Idaho Ghola. He preferred to talk and negotiate while standing, and had many children in his life. After he accepted the mission, his farm was passed down to his oldest daughter, Dimela, who was married to a man named Phyrus. They had 3 children together. Even though he had retired, Miles still had a spy network inside the Sisterhood which informed him of everything happening there. Those were chaotic times, and this was the most important mission he had ever received. Burzmali was the current Supreme Bashar of the Sisterhood. Miles knew him, and he was a good man. It is said that these Duncan Idaho Gholas had genetic alterations made by the Bene Tleilax. His nervous system had been adapted to the current one humans had evolved. Slight changes, but still significant. This is interesting, and I like this detail. How it is directly described that, in these 5,000 years from Paul's time, humans have actually evolved. Nice detail. Since the day Miles was tasked with protecting Idaho, he identified that Shvang Yu was a threat to the boy by using his Mentat and Bene Gesserit training on her. Miles saw right through the old Reverend Mother. She was a threat, and Taraza told him to get rid of any threat and to protect Duncan at all costs. Once the time was right, Miles would finish off Shvang Yu. In Heretics of Dune, we finally get to see the Bene Tleilax perspective of the universe for the first time. Bandalong is described to be the greatest Tleilaxu city, their capital and the cradle of the Bene Tleilax civilization. They had been finally formally introduced into the story and described for the first time. The Tleilaxu masters were short grey elves with sharp teeth. To the other people, they could seem like strange children in costume, or something out of an ancient fairy tale. They could either look very adorable, but whenever necessary, very monstrous in expression. Many Islamiyat terms are also introduced. Islamiyat is the secret Bene Tleilax language, which they use only amongst themselves, not even sharing it with their face dancers. Mahai was the title of the supreme leader of the Bene Tleilax, and the current Mahai was a master named Waff. It is described that he wears a kilat, an honorary robe all Tleilax must bow upon seeing. Mashaiks are the members of the Supreme Tleilaxu Council, which is called Kel. Along with Waff, there are 9 other Mashaiks, making it 10 in total. Yagist is the Tleilaxu realm. Everything they rule. Anytime a Bene Tleilax leaves the Yagist realm and returns, he has to go to with the Guthrum ritual. That is, to ask for forgiveness for stepping on unholy soil, to clean their spirit from the dirt of the outside world. The people outside Yagist are all called Poindas. They are heretics and inferiors, unbelievers of the true religion, the Shariat, which is how the secret Bene Tleilax religion is called. It is unknown even to the Bene Gesserit, or so do the Tleilaxu masters believe it to be. The Bene Tleilax had Sufis and Sunni origins. In that sense, they were kin to the original Fremen of Dune. Waff meets with his Cal to talk about an important matter, the Atreides Manifesto, a document that could bring chaos upon the non-Yagist universe. Now, what is written in the Atreides Manifesto is never truly described in Dune. We only receive hints, but my theory is that it essentially questions every religion and group outside the Bene Tleilax and exposes the truth behind the Dar-es-Balat discovery. Back at the end of God Emperor of Dune, it is mentioned how the Dar-es-Balat discovery was kept a secret from the rest of the universe, and it would make sense for it to be revealed with the Atreides Manifesto. The Tleilax saw Leto II as a prophet, not a tyrant, for he and Paul were the only non-Tleilax who believed in the Shariat. The Tleilax decided to publish the Atreides Manifesto and bring upon chaos to the non-Yagist universe. Along with that, they had another 2 in their plan, the Ghola at planet Gammu. The Masters controlled the language of genetics, the language of God in the Shariat. And with that, the Tleilax had developed new face dancers, far harder to be identified by the Bene Gesserit than the older models. The Cal then discusses the other factions and how they could react to the manifesto. Ix and the Fish Speakers would most definitely ally to the Bene Tleilax. The guild would stick with them, for they need the artificial melange they produce. This new group, the Honored Matres, would most definitely end up causing a war with the Bene Gesserit, and both groups would be destroyed by that. The Cal comes to the conclusion that the prospects are positive. Their plan will work out. And as it is revealed, all 10 of the Cal are Golas, reborn through many generations of new bodies to maintain this long-in-the-making plan. One of them, called Mirlat, is a Gola with the memories of Siteo, the face dancer who talked with Paul and discovered that it was possible to resurface the genetic memories of a Gola. There's another Siteo mentioned here, but this one is a separate Gola, the youngest member of the council. This is probably the same Siteo we'll come to see in Chapter House Dune. So besides Waff, this Siteo is the most important character here. Waff visited the Lashkar once more. He had to meet with an honored Matre who had summoned his presence. Some of the face dancers that came back from the scattering gave him intelligence about the situation out there, but he doubted the validity of this intelligence. Those returned ones were no longer Malik brothers, they were impure. So came the day Waff met with the old honored Matre in her private audience room inside an Ixian no-ship. It was believed that the honored Matres were much more numerous than the Bene Gesserit and way more dangerous as well. They used orange contact lens, but lacked the memories of their ancestors and didn't partake in melange rituals, for in the scattering there was no melange. Now, this is interesting that, at first, it is described that they wear orange contact lens. But later in this book, and in Chapter House Dune, this is never brought back ever again. Instead, it is said that their eyes turn orange naturally. So maybe Frank changed his vision of the Matres but forgot to correct this first mention of their eyes? Anyways, it is said that those Matres made sexual decisions. They were monsters who enslaved men with sex. During their talk, Waff was quick to realize that the Matres were arrogant and thought of themselves as being way higher than everyone else. She didn't want to negotiate with Waff, only gather information about the Gola they had given the Sisterhood. It is possible that they have spies amongst the Bene Gesserit, and they could, unexpectedly, use the voice to a certain extent, but not on the same level as the Bene Gesserit. Waff wonders if this old woman can read minds. He ponders if these Matres were also Zensuni, but as their conversation went, he realized they were just cold and logical. But not as logical as Mentats, for their rationale was faulty. Their conversation ends, and Waff correctly ascertains that the honored Matre want to find a way to break the Oracle blind spot with the no ships and no rooms, believing that this Gola in Gammu was able to do exactly that. The honored Matre wanted to enslave the Bene Tleilax to their cause as well, so she let 2 other younger Matres to come in. One of them was a new face dancer, the type which could copy memories. Waff, upon realizing the Matres couldn't distinguish face dancers, used this opportunity and, with 2 hidden throw-in poison darts from under his sleeves, killed the older Honored Matre and the second one which had just entered the room. He was unable to escape a kick by the older Matre, though, which landed on his leg. If it had landed in his chest or head, he'd be dead by now. That was how strong and quick those Matres were. Way stronger than the Bene Gesserit indeed. Other face dancers, previously with semblances of Ixian engineers, copied those dead honored Matres. Waff had successfully infiltrated their group, another advantage for the Bene Tleilax. Sheeana was a girl who lived with her family, poor and of low social status, part of a small tribe in the middle of the deserts in Rakis. One night, she left the camp to find spice melange out in the desert. The melange had a very deflated price and was a common product in the Old Imperium, but was still valuable enough to provide people with a considerable buying power, especially the poorest of the poorest, of whom Sheeana's family was part of. Sietches no longer existed, only the ruins and myths of a glorious past. Sheeana's people returned to the desert because of their Fremen ancestry. They were fueled by the same anger the Fremen had and despised and feared the Church of the Divided God for their tyranny. Modern-day Rakis had people using water barriers to defend their encampments and cities from the Sandworm attacks. Such cities like Keen, modern-day Arakeen, had proper quanets doing the job, with many protective layers against the Sandworms. Water seemed to not be an issue anymore, at least for the rich Church of the Divided God. Keen, once known by as Arakeen, once known by as On, had been changed its name once more after the scattering. Unfortunately, Sheeana's camp was attacked by a sandworm. It turns out, a piece of the water protection had dried up because of sand trouts. Nothing was left of the people who lived there, only Sheeana. And upon returning to that devastated place, she discovered that their camp had been risen atop a pre-spice mass, which exploded and attracted the sandworm. They had gold right underneath their feet, and Sheeana had just left to look around for scraps, an act which ended up saving her life. The sandworm had not left the camp yet, making it possible for Sheeana to run up to it and punch it. Strangely, the sandworm didn't attack her, but instead stayed completely immobile. Sheeana ended up climbing the sandworm, and after doing so, the creature, of which she called Shaitan, as everybody beside the clergy of the Divided Church also did, took her directly to the city of Keen. A one-day journey lasted under an hour. The sandworm stopped very close to the protective quanets. It let Sheeana step down. She stayed right in front of the sandworm and shouted her anger at it. It had killed everything she knew and loved, but refused to eat her. The sandworm just left Sheeana unharmed and went back to the desert. Curiously, the sandworm mouth is described as being a scorching hot furnace with many fire pits, producing oxygen and melange. Calling back to the first Dune book, sandworms weren't described like this at all. My theory is that they evolved since the collapse of Leto II, changed with time, or maybe it was just the way Frank described them differently. Like what I talked about the eyes of Ibad at the end of the previous book. An ornithopter arrived and priests of the Divided Gods Church came to worship Sheeana, calling her as daughter of Shai-Hulud. The Divided God clergy calls the sandworms as Shai-Hulud, while Sheeana and the rest of people called them Shaitan. Back when all this happened, Sheeana was only 8 years old and knew not what to do, so she started dancing a cultural and religious dance. The priests understood this as she asked for Shai-Hulud to forgive the sins of her people. She was brought to live under their care and her life changed completely. Hedley Tuek, whose ancestors appeared back in the first Dune book, was the high priest of the Divided Gods Church. His council of priests had a discussion about what to do with this Sheeana girl. A man called Styros, who completely opposed the presence of Sheeana, had the idea to test her, to bring her to the desert once more and see how the sandworms reacted to her. That happens. The girl was brought to the desert and 2 sandworms came and ate the tumper that attracted them, but they left Sheeana unharmed. The girl ordered them to go back to the desert. The sandworms obeyed her. The next day after this happened, saw the Bene Gesserit embassy at Keen sending a report of this event to Planet Chapter House. Sheeana, after her test in the desert, woke up surrounded by priests and priestesses. The woman had a lower status and power in the Church of the Divided God. That would change with Sheeana's presence. Kenya was an older woman. She is said to be Sheeana's servant during the night, while Alhosa was her servant during the day. Sheeana was quick to realize that everyone around her bed was afraid of her. So, she ordered the priests away, and only the priestesses to remain with her. Those sent away priests would come to talk about Sheeana behind her back. Dromund was a historian who told the rest of them about how Sheeana was the modern version of the name Siona. Dromund and Styros discussed with the others about who Sheeana could really be and why the Sandworms didn't eat her. Dromund concluded that they should study her, and that's what they did for the following years. With time, though, Dromund became the most disliked amongst the clergy. Tuek had blind faith in Sheeana, and one day he ordered Dromund to be sent to the desert and surrounded with Thumpers, for he was asking far too many questions and committing heresy towards Sheeana. The Bene Gesserit had spies inside the clergy and knew of everything happening around Sheeana. It is said that Tamerlane was the commander of the Sisterhood at the Rakan embassy, and that 4 years had passed since Sheeana was under the church's care. Kipuna was an acolyte who served as a spy from within the clergy, the main source of intelligence they had from what was happening. She brought information about a very recent event with Sheeana. The girl had prohibited the clergy from using the Sandworms to sacrifice innocent people. 2 men were to be executed, but Sheeana ordered them to be set free. That wasn't the only conflict she had with the church. Sheeana called the Sandworms a shaitan, which was heresy in the eyes of the clergy. By this point, it had become evident how the people of Rakis loved Sheeana and hated the divided God's church. Sheeana spread heresies, saying that the divided God was Shai-Hulud and Shaitan together. She used to talk to the Sandworms a lot while visiting the desert. She visited the place her village used to be a lot as well. The Sisterhood investigated and discovered her true story a long time ago, while the priests still believed it was a sandworm that had brought her to Keen. The Bene Gesserit knew that her people had been wiped out. In those visits to the desert, the clergy would secretly wiretap her and listen to her conversations with the Sandworms. Tamerlane managed to wiretap their wiretapping, and also listened in to what Sheeana said. Nothing unknown to the Bene Gesserit was revealed, but every time, the clergy would go into chaos trying to decipher what Sheeana meant when talking to the Sandworms. Many new towers were built around the deserts of Rakis to make it easier for the clergy to watch over Sheeana. This also made it easier for the common people to have access to safe places and water, which also made Sheeana even more popular among them. Tamerlane knew it and reported as such for the Sisterhood. Sheeana was the one they were waiting for a long time. Miles Teg went off orbit from Gammu. The situation down on the surface was getting worse, and Taraza had just arrived in an Ixian ship. The Reverend Mother Superior would never take an Ixian ship to go anywhere. The Sisterhood had their own ships. Something was wrong. Miles knew a possible battle could take place, and he was ready for it. The Ixian technician that led him to Taraza within the No ship told Miles that he was a commander at the Almost Battle and U, another one of Teg's victories. The Bashar met the Mother Superior. The room was smelling sheer, and Teg had just taken sheer pills before leaving Gammu. Taraza looked tired, but she shared just enough information so that Miles knew, through his mentat abilities, that they were under observation by the people from the scattering. A soldier came and confronted Miles, but no battle started, for Teg had 2 No ships prepared to destroy the Ixian transport at any moment. It is described that Miles, by biting his teeth a certain way, brings up some sort of menu to his vision, from which he could use to shoot from those 2 No ships. This is by far the most crazy technological thing ever described in Dune up to this point. I like it because it is obvious that Frank was having a lot of fun by this point. The soldier from the scattering was intimidated enough by Miles Teg. He decided to let Miles, Taraza, and the other Bene Gesserit leave the no ship. Darby Odrade was together with Taraza, and after they left the Ixian transport, she told them how she cancelled Miles' order to destroy the ship. They posed no threat. They wouldn't destroy Gammu. Too many groups and factions from the scattering were located at Gammu during that moment. They wouldn't unnecessarily destroy their own people. Taraza told Miles how they were purposefully captured by the people of the scattering while going to Rakis. It was part of their plan. The Mother Superior was now united with Teg and soon would be with the Ghola as well. They could proceed with their plan. We see the Odrade's perspective of Miles and Taraza's conversation while their shuttle was entering the atmosphere of Gammu. There was a lot of turbulence. Odrade reflected about time. She's now thinking about her first seduction for the Sisterhood, when gathering the genes of her first targeted man. The intercourse led her to understand love and why Jessica failed her mission with Duke Leto. Love was a dangerous thing, a threat to the goals of the Bene Gesserit. Sometimes, Odrade could still remember the face of that first man. No other ever had the same impact as he did on her. Taraza and Miles' conversation continues, but Odrade knows that most of what the Mother Superior is saying is targeted toward her. Miles just had his first contact with the machinations of the honored Matres. They created a dangerous sex cult that could lead humanity to a toxic dependence on them, which would eventually lead to humanity's downfall. Melange had become more accessible. Without the Rakian monopoly, anyone could use Melange to extend their lives, just as Miles did. Taraza reveals how they're all aware about the Atreides manifesto. They read the document themselves. Finally, the shuttle lands at their fort in Gammu. Upon setting foot on the planet, Miles thinks to himself about how it looks like a completely different place. He had seen many planets, but never felt like that before. Everyone there at the fort had both Harkonnen and Atreides ancestry. In a matter of minutes, his perspective had completely changed. Teg saw how people around Gammu had seductive eyes. Foreigners from the planet called that as Gammu eyes. While Teg was there, reflecting, Odrade finally met Lucilla. They interacted briefly. Shvang Yu just came to meet the new visitors who had just arrived. She wasn't informed at all about them because Miles didn't tell her. Taraza and Lucilla would move on to see the Ghola. The Mother Superior told Shvang Yu she would be soon leaving the fort. Shvang Yu was left alone, for Odrade and Miles also walked somewhere else to talk privately. Odrade was direct to the point. She told Miles that he was her father, but that Lucilla, although looking extremely similar to her, was the result of a different lineage. Even so, it was hard not to believe that Lucilla and Odrade weren't twin sisters. All of them were Atreides. All had Sheeana's mark. Odrade reveals to Miles that she was the one responsible for writing the Atreides manifesto under Taraza's orders. As a result, the Tleilaxu were spreading the document as the Sisterhood planned they would. Miles would soon discover the true goal of the Bene Gesserit plan, and once he does, he should take fully independent decisions. By then, he would finally be free from the Sisterhood. The Bene Gesserit needed him to make the human decision they couldn't. Teg believed, as he told Odrade, that the Bene Gesserit were no longer human. This made Odrade sad, for she still felt like a human. Taraza and Lucilla came back. Upon seeing them, Odrade thought about a painting titled Cottages at Cordeville by Vincent van Gogh. The painting could be found in Taraza's office back on Chapter House. She often thinks about that painting. It is said that the work was preserved by the Ixians. A man called Martin Bureau, the same one who created the Ixian probes, also created the mechanism behind that painting, which gave anyone who touches its frames the emotions Van Gogh felt while painting it himself. Miles was in his office at their fort in Gammu. Taraza and Odrade had given him too much information to process, and now they had left already. Miles went deep into his Mentat compute instance and recalled back what is known as the Baradinko incident, when Miles and Taraza had met and signed a new treaty. This part of the book describes how Taraza and Miles basically used Star Trek food replicators to make some creamy brown drinks. This is not the only reference to another sci-fi media from that time, as we will see in this book later on. But it is very interesting to see Frank making this reference to Star Trek. Taraza saw Miles as part of the Sisterhood, the same way another Reverend Mother would be. Some Reverend Mothers, such as Miles' own mother, were heretics, for they didn't obey 100% of the orders given to them. In this case, Miles was taught far too much about the Sisterhood's secrets. People used to live short lives, only a maximum of around 100 years. Melange changed that. Taraza once told Miles about how he was a Mentat interested in philosophy. Few were such Mentats. The Bene Gesserit practiced only one Satori and Sunni ritual in their entire lives, the Spice Agony, for them to become Reverend Mothers. At this point, Shvangyu had been prohibited from doing anything at all in Gammu, as Miles reflected. After computing for a while, Miles woke back from his Mentat stance and saw his own office in the fort with completely different eyes. His Mentat abilities were somehow amplified. He could now see atoms themselves and nuances on everything like never before. Something had changed. Night was falling outside. Duncan was almost 16 years of age. He was training once more while Lucilla watched him. She had successfully gotten closer to Duncan. Soon would be time for her to imprint him. Lucilla personally wanted to imprint Miles as well, and she would later suggest that idea to Taraza once this mission was over. Duncan finished his training, and then Miles arrived at the square out of a dark passage. Idaho ran up to him, but both he and Lucilla were quick to realize that this man wasn't Miles Teg. It was a new Tleilaxu face dancer with a lasgun, there to kill the Gola. Duncan and Lucilla jumped around. They tried to get closer to the face dancer to kill him, but then the real Miles Teg came from behind the enemy and killed it with a lasgun of his own. Miles and Patron knew of these infiltrators. Their team was wiping Gammu Fort clean out of them. Belonda, another important Reverend Mother of the Sisterhood, had warned Miles about the new ability the face dancers had of copying the mind of those they killed. Just like how an Ixion probe worked. They knew that Shvangyu was together in this assassination plan, but it turns out the face dancers had also exploded her quarters. She would be dead as well, were it not for Patron, who had taken her out of there. After some explosions and battles around the fort, Miles led Lucilla and Idaho away from the place. They had to hide in the forest, while Patron remained behind with Shvangyu. 3 days had passed since Miles, Lucilla, and Duncan had left the fort. Teg needed information to process their situation, but as for now, he'll do what's his best ability, the unexpected. Patron had stayed behind and was most definitely dead by now. Shvangyu would send scouts after them. That was a certainty. Lucilla had become agitated recently, and Miles believed that he had understood her real objective with Duncan by now. Miles decided that Idaho had to be awakened before Lucilla imprints him. Only Teg himself knew about the real plan. Patron had discovered long ago a Harkonnen hideout, and that was their objective. This hideout had a Harkonnen No-Globe, which would hide Duncan from scouts who could have the prescience of the Oracle, since he didn't have Sheeana's mark. The place also had enough resources for them to stay there a long time, so they went through passages, mountain paths, swamps, and forests to get to the place. Miles recalled how his mother had trained Teg with woman to make him resistant against Bene Gesserit's seduction. This is important, and it will come back in Chapter House Dune. So it's a curious line presented here. It also means that Lucilla's idea of imprinting him would also fail. She would never be able to take hold of him. An ornithopter passed up above, but the little group remained undiscovered. They had to avoid fields and open places. In those, it would be easier for them to be spotted. Upon getting close to the location of the No-Globe, Miles left traces and marks on some trees with his knife. Only his men would recognize those marks, which would seem natural and animal-made to the eyes of everybody else. It so happens that Taraza meets with Waff for the first time. This occurs in a neutral no-ship from the guild. Taraza knows that, supposedly, Waff is the master of masters from the Bene Tleilax. Before this meeting happened, the Bene Gesserit had discovered about the new face dancers, harder to distinguish, and how they work. They knew that the Tleilax had stolen one ship from the scattering and killed the honored Matres who controlled it. And they knew that these new face dancers were serving as spies from inside the honored Matres. The Bene Tleilax had learned a lot about the honored Matres and their sexual abilities by studying their bodies and memories from that one no-ship. In their conversation, it is revealed that Shvang-Yu had hired the Tleilaxu to kill the Duncan Idaho Gola, but that the honored Matres were also somehow related to the attack at their fort in Gammu. This time, it is believed that the Tleilaxu failed to assassinate Duncan, but the Sisterhood knows that they were behind the murder of the previous Duncan Golas. Sligs were another Tleilaxu invention, a combination of pigs and slugs. They eat anything they find, and their meat was said to be the most delicious one in the entire Old Imperium, according to a Chom propaganda. In truth, the Bene Gesserit knew close to nothing about the Bene Tleilax, but Taraza tries a bunch of hunches in this chapter, and it ends up that she is successful. She says that she knows about the secret weapons Waff is carrying, which he indeed is, under his sleeves. Taraza keeps up the lies as they talk, betting on the little they know and suspect about the Bene Tleilax. Waff accepts to share their knowledge of the honored Matres with them, in trade for the Sisterhood's genetic bank. They could mutually benefit out of this relation and have an upper hand against the honored Matres, their enemy in common. By the end of their meeting, Taraza suspects that Waff and the other Bene Tleilax are Zen Sunni, but she figures out that they are also Sufi. The tyrant was seen as a god by the Tleilaxu. With this newly acquired knowledge, Taraza said the right things to please Waff and make him like her. The agreement was made. It would be officialized in Rakis, where Odrade was commander of the Sisterhood's fort. Waff decided to trust Taraza, as for now, but he remained skeptical if she was really honest with him. These witches knew very well how to lie. Hedley Tuek was irritated with Styros. He was the leader of a powerful faction from within the Church of the Divided Gods clergy, and he could easily get rid of Tuek if he wanted to do so. Styros' actions bordered on heresies, but Tuek defended the idea that Sheeana was testing their knowledge. It is mentioned how the Divided God has a holy trinity. Those three were Paul Muad'Dib, Jessica, and Leto II. Thinking back to this, I think it's pretty obvious that Frank made the Divided Gods Church as a criticizement of Christianity, back when it was said that this was the religion of weak people. This could be something Friedrich Nietzsche could have said, and well, he does say that many times in his works. A predatory religion who seeks the vulnerable. Anyway, let's get back to the story. Here, Styros also mentions Leto III, who died by the hands of the Sardaukar. I imagine this to be Paul and Chani's first baby who died back in the first Dune novel. I don't know if this is some translation mistake, but apparently Leto III is also known as Leto II the Elder, for he died far too young, or maybe this other name was given by Brian in one of his books, who knows. Back to the chapter, Styros was the most cynic person Tuek had ever met. Every sandtrout and sandworm had a little part of Leto's conscience within it. That Tuek knew. But still, it was heresy for Sheeana to call Shai-Hulud a shaitan. After another discussion with Styros, Tuek went to meet Sheeana and talk to her. I can confidently share the theory that the Church of the Divided God is most certainly what became of the Museum Fremen. They had distorted the true culture of the Fremen even before the God Emperor had fallen. And probably it was Garun and his men who created this church to control the melange production, Rakis, and its people. Maybe even Garun was the first high priest, who knows. Sheeana was on the rooftops of the church's highest tower with Kanya, Kipuna, and a younger priest named Baldik. This last guy just completely disappears out of the scene, so he does basically nothing and isn't mentioned at all during the rest of the chapter. So maybe Frank intended him to be a more interesting character, but then cut that out of the work completely, just forgetting to remove this one random mention of him. But I digress. Sheeana had grown older. She had lived under the Divided Gods Church for 6 years now. Before talking to her, Tuek had a premonition of danger. Something was about to happen. He knew it. Sheeana had grown curious about the fish speakers. Once a female-only army under the God Emperor, Muad'Dib created the Tyrant. The Tyrant created Shaitan. Sheeana also wanted to know more about the Bene Gesserit, so she orders Kipuna to bring this Odrade to talk to her. Odrade had been appointed as the new Bene Gesserit commander at Keen. A historian had told Tuek that Odrade was the modern-day equivalent to the old name Atreides, that of the saints Paul and Leto II. Before Kipuna could leave, a sudden attack follows. Some sort of advanced hunter-seeker, with a Shiga wire tied to it, flies around and dismembers Kipuna and the other guards on the rooftops. Tuek, Kanya, and Sheeana managed to escape to the lower levels, through the stairs, in time before the hunter-seeker attacked them. Tuek leads the small group to a safer place, but ends up finding and being surrounded by a large group of the Bene Gesserit, there inside the tower of the church. Odrade had led the sisters to save Sheeana. They knew about this attack. A battle had occurred on the rooftop, ending with sounds of ornithopters and an explosion. Styros was dead. He had been the one who organized the attack with the Ixians and used new Tleilaxu face dancers in his plan. Odrade called out how incompetent Tuek was at protecting Sheeana and ordered him to stay away from her for a while. This is when Odrade finally gets a chance to talk to Sheeana alone. The young girl tells the Reverend Mother how she liked to see Odrade ordering Tuek out of the room. Darwi immediately realized that Sheeana's quarters had an extremely weird shape. She studied the room and discovered that it was perfect for espionage. For anything said there could be listened by multiple different hidden vents. Odrade called another sister and secretly ordered her to discover who was listening in to their conversation. It turns out 4 priests had been ordered by Tuek to listen in. Odrade later sent another secret hand gesture, ordering her sisters to kill all of them off. The Sisterhood had prevented a full-scale attack from happening at the tower. Styros, the Guild, Ix, and Tleilax were all behind this attack, and they would pay for this. Looking back on this part, it is interesting to think about how we saw the beginning of this alliance when the Bene Gesserit denied the invitation to join the resistance against the God Emperor, back during the festival in On. It seems tensions only rose up between the Bene Gesserit and the Rakian Church against Ix, the Bene Tleilax, and Guild. Sheeana was far too spoiled and needed to be taught properly. She ordered Odrade to teach her the voice. The priests had obeyed Sheeana out of fear of God and Tuek, who would punish them like how Dromund was punished. But it wouldn't be the same with the Bene Gesserit. Odrade used herself, the voice, and silenced Sheeana's petulance. This was the beginning of that girl's journey to become part of the Sisterhood. Sometime later, Odrade was watching over Keen from the Bene Gesserit fort there. The priests were to bring Sheeana to stay under Odrade, but they were late already. Odrade recalls memories of studying in the artificial planet named Al-Danab. There, she would soon become commander of security, for the Atreides were good for things of that matter. It is also revealed that Odrade has Jessica's memories, as it so occurs, since she has Sheeana's mark. Odrade caught herself thinking about how the hills to the south of Keen were remnants of the Shield Wall and Sarir Wall, before a group of face dancers appeared in the square in front of the fort. They started doing some ritualistic dance. Odrade soon realized this is what remained of the Sihanouk ritual of the God Emperor. If this is what it had become in the Old Imperium, what did it evolve into in the Scattering? Sheeana's escort was finally in sight. Her guards were taller than 2 meters. The escort met with a group of face dancers in front of the fort and crushed them on their path, before arriving at their destination. After the crowds dispersed, many people were dead, just as the face dancers, stepped and crushed like bugs. Sheeana finally met with Odrade. There was much to teach to this little girl. Now, Odrade realized what Taraza wanted her to do. Darwi had to go to the desert with both Sheeana and this Tleilaxu master named Waff. Something would happen there, in the desert, Odrade knew. Hedley Tuek was in his audience room at the heart of the Temple of the Divided God. Odrade was with him, and they were discussing the Atreides Manifesto and the Divided God's religion. Waff, some priests rival to Tuek, and members of the Sisterhood were all secretly listening in to their conversation. Sheeana was to remain under Bene Gesserit care, for she wishes to become a Reverend Mother. Miles is supposed to arrive any time now in Rakis to take over its defenses for the Sisterhood, but when this will happen is still unclear. They mentioned how the Ixians were to give a new aerial space harvester to the Church of the Divided God. Odrade knows all about the other people listening in to their conversation. Waff had promised Tuek that he would take Sheeana back to the church, off from the Sisterhood's hands. Odrade decides to call out Waff, who comes in and joins the conversation. He sits down and they talk about the Ixians and the fish speakers. Waff thinks to himself about how the fish speakers are under his control, since their leader was now a face dancer. Tuek despised the Atreides Manifesto, and deemed it needed to be destroyed. Odrade then reveals that not only it was a Tleilaxu who spread that document throughout the Imperium, but also that Waff had the intention to kill both her and Tuek right there and replace them with face dancers. With this revelation, Waff acts immediately, using his poisonous needles on both of them. He succeeds on killing Tuek, but fails against Odrade, who reacted fast enough to break his arm and pin him to the ground. Odrade convinced Waff for them to continue with their negotiation. With Taraza's discovery, Odrade used the right words, based off Sufis and Sunni teachings, and convinced Waff to consolidate their alliance against the honored Matres. Then 2 face dancers came into the room and took Tuek's body away. He would be replaced with a face dancer, a deal that Tleilaxu had with Tuek's rivals. While this Tuek copy would serve the Tleilaxu, the real new high priest of the church would be Crutansik, a relative of Styros and leader of Tuek's rivals. Thanks to Odrade's smart thinking, Waff started to believe that the Bene Gesserit weren't Powindas, but sisters in fate, as strange as that sentence sounded. Taraza later received Odrade's report on this whole event. She was over at her office in Chapter House. Her desk was filled with documents. She thought about how Miles had gone missing completely. She thought about how bureaucracy hates new technologies, slows down innovation, and hates anything that could, potentially, bring to light how useless bureaucracy really is. Taraza hated the mentat, librarians, and archivists the Sisterhood had, and she reflected on how the most important bloodlines were all stored and controlled by a computer. This was completely against the Butlerian Jihad. It is said that Odrade collected Waff's sperm, when he briefly fell unconscious after his arm was broken by her. And the deal Odrade held with Waff is described here as well. 300 generations of DNA from the Bene Gesserit bank would be given to Waff. There were more dangerous traitors among the Sisterhood, just like Shvang-Yu. Too much of Taraza's plan relied on Sheeana to be successful. They had to secure all of those important bloodlines at all costs. No more Kvisad Sadrach nor Tyrant should be ever permitted to come to existence. Taraza finally decides to call Burzmali to brief him on his next mission. Odrade would have to deal with Rakis without Miles Teg for now. This chapter mentions how the two other Reverend Mother Superiors were Belonda and Hestarian, and that Taraza knew someday a way to see through no ships and no rooms would be discovered. The secret entrance to the Harkonnen No-Globe was inside a hidden cave. Upon entering, Duncan received a wave of hatred and anger against the Harkonnen symbols in that place. The whole location was pompous and luxurious. Everything there was made to be pleasurable and had an erotic edge. All the food preserved there was filled with melange. A lot of money was spent just for that place to be built. Those builders, Harkonnen slaves, were all killed in order to maintain the place a secret, but the Harkonnen overlords who lived there simply disappeared completely. There was no signal of what had happened to them. And so, the whole place was a time capsule with unimaginable value. After they're at the place for a while, in one occasion, Miles and Duncan finally get some time away from Lucilla, and Teg decides to open up the game completely and tries to awake Duncan's Gola memories. Pain was the only way to awaken a Gola, and in this case, Miles would employ despair and emotional pain to awaken Duncan. The boy reveals that he thought of killing Shvang-Yu himself, but never had the opportunity. Idaho wants his memories back, but he fears them. A fight between the boy and the Bashar starts. Teg purposefully started attacking Duncan when he was falling to despair. As the men fought, Duncan ended up cursing Teg, calling him Leto. At this moment, they stopped the fight. Idaho's memories had started to come back. While Duncan was still staring at him, Teg recalled a rebellion he had to deal in a planet called Serbo. There, his own men had turned against him. But Teg, without fighting, managed to convince the men to rejoin him and serve the Sisterhood once again. Duncan's memories were back, but the Gola felt like there was still more to be revealed. Teg looked a lot like Duke Leto, and Duncan remembered the Sardaukar who had killed him, who managed to do so only after Idaho had already killed 12 Sardaukar all by himself. Miles had achieved his mission. He had brought Duncan's memories back. And now is when Lucilla came into the room. To Duncan, Lucilla looked like Jessica. So with this, we have the confirmation that both Lucilla and Odrade look like Jessica. I was thinking that to myself from the moment both characters were introduced, and it was mentioned that Teg looked like Leto. It would make sense for the Sisterhood to want a Jessica lookalike to imprint Duncan, since Idaho used to secretly love her. With his memories back and upon laying eyes on Lucilla, Duncan knew for sure what was her mission: to imprint him. For the following weeks, Duncan trained, combining both old methods with new ones he had learned at the fort. Differently to the times of Paul, shields weren't used at all. This also calls back to what the Mentat Duncan had said in Children of Dune, the collapse of the Holtzman effect. Shields becoming useless in the future. The transport monopoly of the guild being broken. Duncan and Teg trained with hunter-seekers, and the old Bashar recalled another battle he had, the Battle of Markon. Back then, when the enemy had learned about Teg's presence in the battlefield, he immediately sought to negotiate with the Bashar. That was the power of reputation. Teg also recalled the Battle of Arbelow, which was very bloody and saw action against many face dancers from the Tleilax. This equipment Duncan and Teg used to train was of Harkonnen manufacturing. old but effective enough and with room to be adapted to their current tactical necessities. But still, Teg knew not what Duncan was supposed to do in Rakis. Just as Idaho himself didn't know why Leto II brought him back as a Gola so many times. Why did the Bene Gesserit also bring him back? Neither Duncan nor Miles knew the answer. Duncan still had that weird feeling. He admits that he believes the Tleilaxu did something to him. Lucilla was listening in to them, and she decides to reveal herself and question Duncan about it. Duncan knows not what the Tleilaxu did to him, but he knew that something was off. For a while, Lucilla had been trying to seduce Idaho, but she has failed so far. She thought of a way to get rid of Miles to imprint him, and so she thinks back to her imprinter classes. In one occasion, Lucilla finally managed to meet Idaho alone, at the dressing room. Duncan was feeling sad. He thought about how the Sisterhood hadn't changed for thousands of years. They were still emotionless witches, and how he died a long time ago. Lucilla decides to be honest with Duncan. She mentions Sheeana, and that's when Teg enters the dressing room with a las gun pointed at Lucilla. Miles interrogates Lucilla and uses his mentat abilities to process all available information. He comes to the conclusion that Lucilla was tasked not only to imprint Duncan, but also to make him the most seductive man to serve as a weapon to control both Sheeana and the honored Matres. Lucilla admitted that this was true, and Teg just revealed that the las gun wasn't loaded. He didn't intend on hurting Lucilla, just hearing the truth about their mission. Miles reveals that he received secret messages from Burzmali. A rescue plan was in the making. Now, they had to memorize the maps of Gammu, its important cities and geographical characteristics. Sheeana, Odrade, and Waff were set to go on an incursion into the desert together. Waff's broken arms had been fixed, but in any case, his Tleilaxu brothers were already preparing a new Gola for him. They would just need to get the most recent cells from this body of his to assure that the new Gola would have all of his current knowledge. They were near the Dar-es-Balat museum, which had been built on top of that discovered location. The group heard ornithopters flying nearby. Those were members of the Sisterhood who would watch their incursion and make sure that Sheeana was safe. The little girl had noticed that Tuek had changed. He was acting differently. As they walked near the museum, with the remnants of the Sarir wall up ahead, Odrade suddenly got a flash of memory and saw Leto falling from his bridge into the Idaho River. From where they were, the place Leto had fallen could be seen, and so Odrade showed Sheeana exactly where it had happened. This makes me believe that the cave Leto crawled his way into, at the end of God Emperor of Dune, was the secret entrance to Dar-es-Balat. Being it so, the museum is so close to where the Idaho River flowed by. Nice little detail here. The Sarir wall had completely eroded and was, by now, a bunch of low and scattered rock formations in the desert. Odrade said how people dismantled and destroyed the citadel completely, searching for any stash of melange they could find. Nothing of the citadel had been left by now. While this happened, Waff was daydreaming about the chariot in full power of the universe, with the Sisterhood acting as missionaries, spreading the true religion. Sheeana admitted to Odrade that she disliked Waff. He was a strange man. Her family believed that there was still some hidden melange stash somewhere in the ruins of the Sarir wall. And with that belief, Sheeana ran out into the desert, with Odrade and Waff following right behind her. Sheeana kept running until she reached a sand dune with some rocks nearby. There, she started dancing, like how she did back when the priests first started worshipping her. Every time she went into the desert, Sheeana did this dance to call the attention of the Sandworms. The priests believed that was a ritual for the daughter of Shai Hulud to call upon her father. A sandworm came, standing right in front of Sheeana, with Waff and Odrade right behind her. It is described that the sandworm was like a gigantic furnace, its mouth a scorching hot cavern, filled with rows of teeth and pits of fire. Up to this point, they are never described like this, only if I'm absolutely stupid and missed it when reading the first Dune book. But I trust my memory, they weren't described like this back then. This is why I tell you that the sandworms before and after Leto II are different. They evolved into something far more dangerous than they were in the past. Back to the story, the three characters ride the sandworm with Sheeana taking the lead. The creature directed itself toward the place where Leto dissolved, where Odrade had just showed Sheeana. We see that Waff perceives Sheeana as a messenger of God. She was a daughter of the desert, pretty much the same way as the Church of the Divided Gods sees her. Some time passes and they are still traveling through the desert. It had been a long time since anyone rode a sandworm like this, for the church prohibited anyone from doing it and sacrificed those who dared oppose them. These sacrifices had ceased when Sheeana rose to power within the church. While in the desert, Odrade thought back about how every city center in Rakis was protected by qanats and water barriers. It was near Dar-es-Balat where Albertus, one of the few priests who knew that Tuek was a fence dancer, met her. Odrade remarked on how Albertus had weak genes. His bones were fragile. Not only that, but she knew that this man intended to betray her and try to assassinate her. Odrade revealed that she was aware of that right up to his face. The Church of the Divided God had become irrelevant. Even so, the clergy was against Sheeana being taken to the desert by the Sisterhood and not by themselves, but they could do nothing about it. Albertus would continue giving her reports about the situation within the church, and Sheeana would remain under the Bene Gesserit. The church had no power to do anything anymore. Night slowly fell, but the sandworm didn't stop until it finally reached some ruins of the Sarir wall with many cave entrances. Odrade came back to the present. Both she, Waff, and Sheeana came down from the sandworm and walked around the place. 4 ornithopters from the Sisterhood were flying above as protection and backup. Odrade was quick to realize that those cave entrances were man-made, and that the whole place had an intense smell of melange. They decided to enter one of the caves and found a huge dark room with different levels, as if it had a large pool in the middle. With Odrade's memories of the Fremen ancestors she had, she knew that this place was an old Fremen water reserve, those invented by the Kinds, now empty. Since their departure from Dar-es-Balat, Waff showed a lot about his religious beliefs. That was great information for the Bene Gesserit, which they could use to deal with the other Bene Tleilax. Eventually, the ornithopters landed and dropped ropes and lights so Odrade could explore the place. She eventually stumbled upon a little sand island which was used for juvenile sandworms to be trapped, surrounded by water. By the little she had explored, Odrade was sure that this place was Sietch Tabr, the long-lost and ancient Sietch Paul joined when he had escaped from the Harkonnen and the Sardaukar. As Odrade explored Sietch Tabr alone, she left Sheeana and Waff near the entrance. In and around some corners and corridors, the Reverend Mother found nude mummies. Those were of later people who had found the place in search of any remaining spice melange cache. Those mummies eventually led up to the largest room from Sietch Tabr, the reunion chamber. Odrade knew that there was something hidden in that place. Something felt wrong. There was some kind of danger around the corner. When the tyrant fell, that chamber was filled with melange caches, even inside its walls, floor and ceiling. A lot of melange could be found. Odrade looked around and found Arafel right in between a tight space on the floor. Arafel was the dark clouds at the end of the universe. It was the angel of destruction who would threaten the Bene Gesserit and humanity to utter destruction. Scavengers had broken down the place and melted the walls with flames with the intention to find melange. But they all missed. Right underneath this Arafel message, in some small room on the corner of the reunion chamber, a large space filled with many melange caches. there was enough melange there to build a whole new imperium. Even with the spice deflation adjustments, the God Emperor knew the Sisterhood would be the ones to find that melange stash. For that, he left not only the Arafel message outside, but also a message in the steps of the stairs inside the chamber for the Sisterhood to read. He condemned the Sisterhood for not having the courage to create their own golden path and ended up forcing Leto himself to become the God Emperor. He cursed the Tleilax for their self-worship, and cursed the fish speakers for their bureaucracy. Odrade understood Leto's message. The golden path should continue even if the God Emperor himself fell, and even if the Sisterhood itself came to an end. The golden path would still continue. Would the other sisters understand this message as Odrade did? Taraza was at her office, tired and with piles of documents to go over. She remembers Sister Baram. One of the rare cases, a Bene Gesserit had a genetic defect. In her case, Baram had nerve trembling, and one day, she was found dead because of that disease. Because she was a different sister, she had developed her own methods to calm herself and deal with her problem. Baram had taught Taraza about a technique to relax and calm down. A 100 heartbeat trick. Taraza used this trick to calm herself down, but the memory of Baram and her death sometimes came back. That was Taraza's first contact with death. Burzmali had been sent to Gammu. With the new melange stash Odrade had found, they no longer depended on either Rakian spice nor Tleilaxu spice. It turns out, the secret melange stash Odrade had found had 90,000 tons of spice. By now, the Rakian priesthood posed no real threat anymore. Burzmali had sent information about there being many enemies from the scattering landing in Gammu, and that Shvang-Yu and Patrim had died in some conspiracy, with Miles, the Gola and Lucilla still missing. The honored Matres had orange eyes and they used some kind of adrenaline stimulant as replacement from spice melange. There were too many things and information for Taraza to correctly keep track of, and so she tried to sleep, but couldn't. That night, Burzmali arrived in Chapter House with more news about Gammu. He had investigated the ruins of their fort there further and came to the conclusion that Patrim had used a trapped no-ship and exploded it while still inside, whereas Shvang-Yu was killed with an Ixion probe which had drilled her skull and lobotomized her. That was most definitely the work of the honored Matres. But it was strange that Patrim, apparently, had committed suicide and prevented the enemy from using an Ixion probe in him. His family had lived in Gammu since the times of Giedi Prime. Maybe there was something they were missing there. Burzmali would come back to the planet and scout it himself, for he believed Miles and the others were still hidden somewhere in the planet. Burzmali's plan was to hold a fake funeral for the Bashar Miles Teg, and with that as a facade, they could hold a real investigation on the ground and localize where the Bashar was hiding himself. And with this plan, a long time passes. Burzmali makes contact with Miles, and the day comes when Duncan, Teg and Lucilla leave the Harkonnen No-Globe while carrying a lot of heavy equipment. It was a snowy night. Burzmali prepared his troops for the mission. While they were preparing, Burzmali recalled back to the time of the old houses and of Muad'Dib. 3PO was a term used for products of second category, bought and used by houses which could not afford the more expensive, higher quality products. This is obviously a joke on Star Wars. That being, 3PO sounds very similar to C-3PO, and that Star Wars is a second category cheap copy of Dune, which of course, I think that's pretty much correct. But anyway, let's go back to the story. Teg talked to Burzmali through secret messages, and they made up a plan to take Lucilla and Duncan out of Gammu safely. As they walked around the dark snowy forest, strange sounds could be heard in the distance. Lucilla was the first to realize that those sounds aware of a battle going all around them. Suddenly, many no ships landed from the sky. Troops of face dancers came out of them. Our characters started fighting them with las guns. It didn't take long for the forest around them to start burning with all the lasers. At one point, Burzmali called out for our characters. Duncan and Lucilla went over to him, but Teg had to stand behind and fight off the approaching face dancers. Duncan didn't want to leave Teg behind, but the Bashar used something very similar to the Bene Gesserit voice to order him to go. And so, Idaho obeyed and he left with Lucilla while Teg kept fighting. Light beams cut the forest, burned and destroyed everything. Miles realized how the face dancers wanted to capture him and the others, and eventually his ammunition was over. This was the opportunity for Teg to run over to Burzmali. But from behind, a stun gun took Miles down. The shot came from where supposedly Burzmali had called for them to come. That attack was ordered by the honored Matres, who used no ships from the scattering and extensive numbers of their own face dancers. The same tactic they employed on the Bene Gesserit fort at Gammu. The mission had its objective as the Gula's safety first. Burzmali wanted to rescue Teg as well, but it was too late. The old Bashar was surrounded by his enemies and taken out with a stun gun. Burzmali took Lucilla and Idaho inside an armored vehicle. They drove around and eventually switched to another armored vehicle, while exploding the previous one as a distraction for the enemies. Burzmali employed many misleads and tricks to confuse the enemy. Those would work, temporarily. Burzmali brought Lucilla and Duncan inside a secret room with some of his troops. One of the soldiers had a strange accent. He was a man from the scattering. Lucilla suspected treason from Burzmali. And then, an old woman came inside the room. She wore black clothes just like those of Lucilla, only with the difference that hers had drawings of mythological dragons all over. When the woman, Serapha, spoke, her accent was the same as the strange man. The plan was for Lucilla to disguise herself as an honored Matre and go out as Burzmali's companion, while Duncan would dress up as a Tleilaxu master with his face dancer escort. Serapha would also switch dresses with Lucilla and serve as another distraction. She even changed her old rugged face to look much younger. Serapha told Lucilla that they had a common enemy in the honored Matres. She herself was trained to kill the Matres. They had created a religion in the scattering, where sex was the most sacred thing and Tantras was their deity. Those women were dangerous, and many groups out there also seeked their destruction. Burzmali would go under the name Scar as disguise, while Lucilla would under the name Pyrrha. Pyrrha was to be the fifth adept from the Order of Hormu, whatever that means. And then, in this part, Lucilla teaches Serapha a lot about the job of imprinting and the abilities she has. I won't get into the details here, but so that their disguise becomes a lot more believable, Lucilla and Burzmali would need to do some cardio before leaving that secret room. Odrade was back at the embassy. It is remarked that the Bene Gesserit embassy was the largest one in Rakis. Albertus was still bringing intelligence to Odrade, much to his own disgust. He says that the Tuek face dancer followed up with the original's ideas and has been doing a great job, lying to all the other priests and to his own family, who doesn't suspect a thing. The Tuek family was strong and proud. They had existed since the times of Leto I, when he came to Arrakis. Waff came to meet Odrade. He still doesn't fully believe that the Bene Tleilax and Bene Gesserit shared the same fate. Those sisters were Powinda in disguise. Odrade led them to negotiate as equals. Odrade ordered her sister guards to leave them alone in the room. As they were alone, they spoke in Slamiat. With Shvangyu dead, the Bene Gesserit opposition had no leader anymore. But some sisters still feared the coming of a new Kvisets Hadrach. Odrade shared something Waff already believed himself. The Tleilaxu from the Scattering could not be trusted. They belonged to the honored Matres now. And now, the Tleilax and sisters had to secure a solid alliance against those from the Scattering. Idaho and Sheeana would reproduce and their heirs would be the future leaders of their union. The meeting went on, and later, Taraza received news from Rakis. The Bene Gesserit would become missionaries for the Bene Tleilax. This was enough for Reverend Mother Belonda to want Odrade's execution for treason. Darwi had Corino, Atreides, and Harkonnen ancestry. Her genes were valuable, but Taraza knew that those genes also brought a hunger for power she knew that Odrade secretly had. Odrade, after surviving the Spice Agony, was sent to Al-Danab, an equivalent to Seleucus Secundus, to be trained there. Belonda met Taraza to discuss against this Tleilaxu alliance. She argued that the Tleilax created monsters, but if they sided with the honored Matres, this enemy would gain access to spice melange, and that ought to be prevented. Another thing that was unclear was what the Tleilax really did to Duncan Gola. They knew something was off with him. It was obvious that every single Gola the Tleilax gave them was different from the previous. The Sisterhood never fully understood the tyrant's interest with Duncan. His aim was diversity and humanity's survival. Were the honored Matres part of his plan? Belonda wasn't trustworthy anymore. She could even be the new leader of the opposition, in place of Shvang Yu. The tyrant had warned the Bene Gesserit would meet their end. Taraza thought about how Chapter House was a temporary planet, but the Sisterhood had indeed built a large metropolis there. The planet was hidden behind a barrier of no ships, making its location hidden well enough from anyone who might try looking for it. There was an enormous diversity of peoples, with varying technologies and cultures, coming back from the Scattering to the old Imperium. Taraza decided she would go to Rakis herself and deal with Odrade. It came the day Taraza and Odrade met in Rakis. Darwi was just then thinking about that Van Gogh painting, and how Rakis had strangely gotten hotter recently. In the conversation between the Reverend Mothers, Odrade reveals that she was forced to embark in this deal with the Tleilaxu because any of the other options were unacceptable. She believed that the axolotl tanks the Tleilax used for their creations were actually the female Bene Tleilax, used to grow their monstrosities inside themselves. Waff had admitted to Odrade how they killed the previous Duncan Golas because of shame, for they failed to match the specifications the Bene Gesserit gave them. Not only that, the honored Matres wanted to kill Idaho because he presented a grave threat to them, as Waff had also admitted that they made Idaho to be a male honored Matre. Not only that, but Lucilla was tasked to make him irresistible for women. Even though the Sisterhood had a wide array of imprinting skills, those were far from surpassing what the honored Matres had in storage. It was concerning that Lucilla hadn't reported her mission back to Taraza. Only those with an immense psychological strength could survive being awakened as a Gola. Duncan, such as he himself had gone through the process many times, had that required strength. Taraza wanted Odrade to act independently, and she did, but went too far. Odrade was far too similar to her own father, and just like him, Taraza wanted her to act independently. Sheeana was brought to meet the Reverend Mother Superior Taraza. The girl was tested there and well met Taraza's expectations. She had the potential to make a great Reverend Mother. Miles Teg wakes up in some sort of flying cage. He was trapped, and a small group of soldiers from the Scattering were taking him to a broken down cabin. On the outside, the place looked abandoned, but on the inside, it was a luxurious place. In there, he saw what looked like an Ixian probe. Good thing he was saturated with shear. They wouldn't be able to take anything out of him. 3 strange people came inside with Miles. They would interrogate him. One of them, an employee, as he was called, was obviously the highest ranking out of them. He opened up a small suitcase and left it on a position where its calm eye could be able to see everything around the room. Calm eyes are this technology which serves as a camera. They can record everything that is happening around them. We will see this technology a lot more in Chapter House Dune. But right now, we have this employee transmitting this interrogation to somebody else. A higher ranking official of the honored Matres, no doubt. Those three refer to that probe Miles saw as a T-probe. They placed it on Miles' head, even though they knew that he was saturated with shear, and turned the machine on. The pain Miles felt was the worst. He had never experienced something like that. As the machine drilled his head, Teg had some sort of deja vu. This whole situation seemed familiar, as if he had passed through this before. One of the men was named Yar. He seemed to be a native of Gammu, while another of those people was, in reality, a woman. The other two referred to her as Matrina, but Teg was unsure if that was a name or a title. That woman would play the role of the good cop and ask Teg to cooperate with them. She asked him to open up to them, so that this torture could end. Miles realized that this T-probe didn't have the same function as a normal Ixian probe. It was something far worse, some sort of technology from the scattering. While in pain, Miles compared that trio to Dit, Dat, and Dot. Three puppets from a children's show he had watched when young on Lerniles. Those three servants were mere puppets. Their lives didn't matter to their superiors. Teg remembered many events of his life. He remembered the Battle of Pontiard, and then suddenly, unexpectedly, he overcame the T-probe, took it off his head, and broke free from the floating cage. Some inhuman strength and speed led him to kill the three puppets with ease, crushing their necks. Miles had seen their attacks before they had even moved. That T-probe had somehow turned Miles in some sort of super mentat. He could compute information at such high speeds, he was able to predict the future just with the information he was given. After also killing the other guards outside the cabin, Miles decided that he would go toward Ysai, and from there, steal a nose ship from the honored Matres. Teg eventually found himself in a large highway leading directly to that city. He was still adjusting to his new abilities. He could foresee a short extent into the future, but had no memories of his ancestors. On a certain distance, Teg joined a crowd of merchants, who circled him and hid him. They revealed themselves to be soldiers who had fought with him in Rendi Tai. They told Bashar that many people from the scattering were looking for him. Eventually, a dark vehicle passed by and collected Teg, another one of his soldiers helping the Bashar. This vehicle was property of Gammu's planetary bank, and so nobody would stop it, no matter how fast it went. Miles realized his sense of time had completely changed. 2 days had already passed since he escaped the interrogation. Although it is not described, I believed Miles is walking around with a hole in his head from the T-probe. But maybe the drill part was only for the Ixian probe. But I digress. Teg was hungry, very hungry and tired. They quickly stopped so that the Bashar could drink some soup in a random residence. The man in that place was very ugly and had many artificial body replacements. He admitted to Miles that he had been injured at the explosion of Allegeri, but even with that, Teg didn't recognize him. After the quick stop, they returned to the road. The driver told Teg that the honored Matres had been in Gammu for around 100 years, and then they finally arrived at Ysai, a very ugly city. Teg was left on one of the supposed safe places they had in Ysai, a weird dark building. After standing around outside, Miles entered the building and went up some floors. In there, Teg unexpectedly met a mercenary. The man was from the scattering. His name was Jaffa Muzaffar, a commander of Dur. Jaffa admitted that he was behind the torture Teg suffered with the T-probe. He had studied about Miles, but never expected to meet Bashar himself. While they were talking, a suck doctor came in. He had an orange diamond in his forehead, instead of it being black. His name was Solitz, and his eyes were orange as well. That Suck Doctor was from the Scattering, some weird divergent branch from the real Suck Doctors of the old Imperium. Solus confirmed that Miles was well but hungry. The Suck Doctor called Jaffa as Marshal at one point, so that was his rank. Miles had already started ranking their command structure. Jaffa told Miles that he had built his home out of a structuring bush, some sort of plant from the Scattering, a Tleilaxu invention, which changed its shape in accordance with its master's desires. But those plants were tough to tame, and apparently Jaffa tamed the most wild one out of them. After the Suck Doctor left, a female waiter with a shaved head started bringing food to Teg. The Bashar kept eating and ate so much that he left both the waiter and Jaffa speechless. The Marshal had never seen anyone eat as much as Teg had. Mentats had to eat a lot to maintain their brain functions and abilities, and since Teg awakened those powers, he felt like he needed more food than ever. And after Teg ended eating, Jaffa left the room in a hurry. He was scared, for an honored Matre was going to meet Miles Teg and mark him. Lucilla and Burzmali were walking down the streets of southern Ysai. The roads were dirty and snowy. Many people passed by around them, focused on their daily routines, going from and to their jobs, their homes. At one point, a group of children followed Lucilla and Burzmali. They intended on stoning the two. They were followers of Guldur, a regional name for the Tyrant, a scattering invention. Burzmali dispersed the children away. Lucilla saw two Tleilaxu masters hidden in a disguise, one on top of the other, hidden by a large trench coat, buying some products in a nearby marketplace. Those were not the only Tleilaxu masters doing that, and Burzmali and Lucilla would come to identify many others around Ysai. They saw addicts and people resting in the streets. It is said that Hypnobong was a machine that gave people the same sensation as if they used mind-altering chemicals. Lucilla saw one such machine in an alleyway with some customers paying for its use. Most interesting of all, they saw a disguised Fotar sitting on the crosswalk. Those creatures, Fotars, were a Tleilaxu experiment, which had returned from the Scattering. Man united with beast, a first creature which the Bene Gesserit had only previously heard rumors about. Now Lucilla was certain that those creatures were indeed real. They stopped at the restaurant for a while, as part of the disguise, but shortly after they left the establishment. Lucilla heard Semuta music being played somewhere nearby in the streets, before they arrived in one of the safe places in Ysai. That was an old, dilapidated apartment, and there an old woman received them. That old lady claimed to be part of the honored Matre resistance, but Lucilla realized that she had been once a priestess in Rakis. The lady claimed to still serve the great Guldur, but Lucilla was rude to her and offended her. Burzmali disliked how Lucilla made the lady cry, and it turns out, as Lucilla reflected while resting a bit, she despised what the people of Rakis had become. Lucilla just absolutely hated them. Little of their strong ancestors' culture was left. They were just the weak bottom of society now. After some time, Lucilla and Burzmali were back at it, walking through the streets. Many artificial no-ship moons were created around Gammu. Those were under Bashar Teg's orders, part of his defense system. If Miles had so many defenses in Gammu, how come he didn't know about how the cities were crawling with enemies? Maybe those were just doing surveillance around their fort in the middle of the forest, but I digress. Lucilla and Burzmali were almost reaching their destination, a safe place from which they could get a no-ship. The snow was getting thicker. Lucilla was growing irritated. They entered through a secret passage to an old Harkonnen factory. That was their destination, but unexpectedly, another woman wearing a dragon robe appeared and approached them. The honored Matre's name was Murbella, and she almost killed Burzmali, for the simple reason that he talked to her without her permission. Lucilla prevented Murbella from killing Burzmali, and that Matre shared how she believed Lucilla to be a great honored Matre, a superior rank, which Murbella seeked to become herself one day. Apparently, Duncan had been captured. Murbella was about to lay with him and mark him as her slave. It so turns out that safe haven was filled with enemies. Duncan and his guide journeyed through many bridges, paths, neighborhoods, alleys, and forests. To Idaho, this whole planet didn't seem like the old Giadi Prime he remembered. There was too much green, too many relatively happy people. Giadi Prime was grey, industrial, and depressing. Duncan looked like a Tleilaxu master, and his hair had even been dyed. His disguise's name was to be Woes. Both the night and the snow had covered everything, and his guide, Anbitorn, was taking the role of the face dancer. His disguise's name was Tormsa, and that's how the Gola should call him. Idaho was still thinking about how Teg sacrificed himself so that he and Lucilla could escape away, exactly how Duncan had sacrificed himself for Paul and Jessica. Ever since Duncan had been awakened, he had noticed how the Galach language had changed since the times of Paul. Slight but noticeable changes. Anbitorn took out a monocular and looked around Ysai. Then he shared the monocular with Duncan. Ysai had a central building with 950 floors. It was the Barony, the 45-kilometer-tall central of operations of the Harkonnens back in the times of Paul Muad'Dib. Duncan and Anbitorn were to stay in a passage during the night and behave like animals, so the Ixian raiders up above would ignore them, believing the Dew to be wildlife. But as we come to learn later, Anbitorn was killed and Duncan was captured, with him waking up and remembering barely anything from what had happened. Duncan remembered he was in Giadi Prime, and he remembered how a jealous girl had given him as a slave to the Harkonnen. He recalled memories from his first life and then of his Gola life. The barony used to be filled to the brim with people living miserable lives. The place now looked way more primitive than how it did in the past, just as the whole city of Ysai looked nothing like how the city did in the past. Murbella finally met Duncan. He realized he was strapped to a cold bed and that he was naked, and so was Murbella. She was to dominate him, mark him as her slave. Too many details I cannot share here in YouTube. You probably understand. The action between Duncan and Murbella was the key to bring back all the memories he was still suppressing. All the memories of every single past Gola incarnation Duncan ever had. He remembered every single death. In one, he fell from an ornithopter. In another, he was stabbed by a fish speaker. In another, crushed by Leto. In another, killed by his own bomb. And many others. He remembered axolotl tanks and how they looked. Monstrous masses of female Tleilax bodies connected to tubes and machines. Devoid of life, serving just as liquid recipients to grow the Tleilax abominations. Duncan also awakened certain sex powers the Tleilaxu had given him. He subdues Murbella. He had essentially become a male honored Matre, and now Murbella was his slave. She'll do everything he asks her to do. Burzmali and Lucilla come into the room after all of this takes place, and Murbella is powerless on the floor. They had watched the whole thing from the other side of a glass nearby. Murbella begged Lucilla to kill Duncan, for he was too dangerous to be left alive, but Lucilla answered that this Gola would be taken to Rakis. Taraza, Sheeana, Odrade, the Tuek face dancer, Waff, and some Sisterhood, Tleilax, and divided god priests were united. They met at the Dar-es-Balat museum in an apartment. Their intention there was to end the conflicts still left amongst the Bene Gesserit, Bene Tleilax, and the divided god Church. The Tuek face dancer joined the priesthood discussion, ignored one accusation on him not being the real Tuek, and was even rude toward Waff and the other face dancers. Funny fella, a real Chad. This fake Tuek seemed to really believe that he was the real Tuek. He was chosen to remain as High Priest with Bene Gesserit's support and protection, much to the dismay of the other priests. Waff was once more distrusting the Bene Gesserit. He went from trusting them, then not, then trusting them again, and them not again. Waff had reincarnated so many times as a Gola, but even with that, he knew he wasn't as old as the Bene Gesserit when it came to having memories of the past generations. A thought which not only Waff had, but Odrade and Taraza as well, was the fact that some Bene Tleilax had returned from the scattering, but not even a single Bene Gesserit had come back. The Sisterhood did send scout missions to the scattering. All vanished without ever reporting back. This was new information Taraza had given Waff. And then, she follows Odrade's theory that the axolotl tanks were female Bene Tleilax and challenges Waff. It turns out, she was right again. Waff decides to share how the Tleilax had studied and tried the honored Matres orgasmic techniques. He demonstrated it with two of his face dancers, right there in the Dar-es-Balat museum. The results were terrifying. The Bene Gesserit witnessed what the Matres had done in the scattering, and now back in the old Imperium. Nobody could hold such power like that. As Odrade had thought to herself some time ago, the Sheeana ritual had become a simple face dancer ritual in Rakis, whereas in the scattering with escaping fish speakers, it had become the honorable Matre dominion. Muzafar brought Teg to an isolated building in the surroundings of Ysai. That place was supposedly another one of the safe havens Teg's men had mapped. His intelligence on them was completely outdated, as we can see. Inside that building, Teg finally got to meet the honored Matre. The place seemed to look exactly the same since Teg's supervision there. The enemies of the scattering must have occupied it very recently. Teg met the honored Matre inside a small room. She wore a red and golden robe. She was direct to tell Teg that she wanted Miles to join the honored Matres and to serve them instead of the Bene Gesserit. If he didn't accept to serve willingly, they had methods to convince him. Here it is revealed that the more orange an honored Matres' eyes are, the angrier they are as well. Otherwise, they seem like completely normal eyes. The great Matre ordered Muzafar to bring the other Matre who would mark Miles Teg, since he didn't accept to cooperate with them. And so, Miles saw the immediate future. He would be the last man standing inside that building. The bodies of Muzafar, his men, and all the honored Matres would be left lifeless and cold, behind him on the floor. After the fight was over, Teg had killed around 50 people with his bare hands when he had left the building. He was covered in blood, and thinking about how he had moved too fast, faster than any normal human ever could move. He walked for around 5 kilometers to distance himself from the slaughterhouse and hid himself in an alley, unable to completely understand these new mentat powers. Teg finally realized that his left hand's palm skin had been ripped off, with his dark blood leaking out. His blood was filled with oxygen. He ran over to another one of those supposed shelters, a mid-class restaurant which was once rich with automatons as waiters. Teg knew that he would meet a man there who could give him some answers he needed. Teg entered the place and sat down, and eventually the waiter came and treated Miles' hand. He was another soldier from Rendi Tai. Many of his soldiers from that battle had settled in Gammu and were living in the planet now. The waiter told Miles how the honored Matres were hunting him down, and there was the Bashar, covered in blood with his uniform. The waiter accepted to bring Miles as much food as he needed. He was once again extremely hungry and tired. To move at such speeds took a toll on his energy and drained him completely. That restaurant might not seem very rich, but it was just a facade. Every single detail there was planned and done on purpose, for the owners had a lot of money behind that appearance. The waiter came back and first brought a bowl of soup. Teg recalled how the soldier had also served him in a clean. Another customer in that restaurant was Professor Downey, a recurring customer. Teg noticed the man and they soon talked. This Downey dressed very badly and in ugly clothes. Downey helped Teg disguise himself as a sewage worker, and they left to go to another safe place which was filled with the Bashar soldiers. A bar. It had started raining when Miles was going to that place, and once he arrived there, Miles took a shower and dressed once more in his uniform before meeting his men. Downey called for everyone's attention and Teg started a speech for all of his soldiers in that establishment. They would capture a no-ship from the scattering, kill honored Matres and go to Rakis. That was his plan, and his men cheered and followed the Bashar. Teg knew exactly where there is a no-ship and how to acquire it. He knew exactly what to do to help Lucilla, Duncan, Burzmali, Odrade and Taraza. All of that thanks to this new mented vision of his. It was almost like prescience. Almost as if, like Paul Atreides, he had become a Kvisitz Hadrach. Teg did have those Atreides genes, after all. Taraza was smelling the flowers of the hanging gardens of Dar-es-Balat. Something had to calm her down, for the reports from Gammu were all chaotic and incoherent. She thought about the tyrant within every single sandworm and sandtrout, and how Sheeana would dance for the main members of the Alliance and call another sandworm for them. She thought about how Sheeana's Bene Gesserit sex classes had started earlier than expected because of the Tleilaxu demonstration the other day, of which Sheeana took part in watching as well. The girl had asked a lot of questions about the Honored Matres to Odrade last night. She was getting very curious about these women. There were those who could resist the Honored Matres' power, just as there were those who were able to resist the Bene Gesserit's voice. But those were few. The Old Imperium was an easy target for the Honored Matres because it was stagnant. The Sisterhood hadn't changed in a long time and kept everything the same way for far too long. Taraza knew this to be a big weakness of their part. Waff, Sheeana and Tulushan came to meet Odrade and Taraza. This Tulushan was the newest representative for the Rakian priesthood. They were all waiting for ornithopters to arrive with more important people before Sheeana called the Sandworm. Taraza's last thought before hearing the ornithopters was that Odrade was a good teacher for Sheeana. Then, she noticed how the Thopters came from the wrong direction they should have. It was a surprise attack by the Honored Matres. They used las guns and chopped Taraza's body in half. Before the Mother Superior died, Odrade came to her and they touched foreheads, sharing all their memories with each other. This was an ancient method of transferring memories the Bene Gesserit had developed, similar to how the new face dancers had to touch the foreheads of their victims to acquire their memories. With Taraza's memories, Odrade took Sheeana and they escaped away while the Matres destroyed Dar-es-Balat. Waff and Tulushan had disappeared completely. Miles was successful in capturing the no-ship, but many of his soldiers had died, and many others started questioning the Bashar's orders. He ordered the ship to land in the middle of the desert in Rakis. He knew exactly where to land. All Miles needed now was for his men to keep eyes all around the no-ship, watching. Teg, with his influence over the soldiers, saw how easy it was to manipulate them. He knew exactly what to say and how to behave. His reputation alone did most of the job for him. In that moment he understood the honored Matre perspective, how they felt superior to everyone else with their inflated ego. Before leaving Gammu, they had rescued Lucilla, Burzmali, and Duncan, and captured the prisoner Murbella. They were all inside the no-ship this very moment. Lucilla had a brief conversation with Teg, but was unable to understand how he knew everything he knew and why he was making such strange decisions and relaying such strange orders. Teg knew that the honored Matres already had control over the Rakian cities. He knew that they had the axolotl tank knowledge and how to use them. And he also knew that it was possible to create spice melange out of the human body. A secret the Bene Gesserit could themselves discover and start producing it with their own bodies. Odrade and Sheeana arrived at the no-ship's location by riding a sandworm. The girl helped the crew store the sandworm inside the no-ship's cargo. And then Odrade met Teg. She immediately noticed that her father was acting very differently from before. From the little they talked, Odrade realized her father knew very well about Taraza's plans and somehow knew exactly where Odrade and Sheeana were at. Miles knew what was about to happen to Rakis. Teg passed down the control of the ship to Burzmali and ordered his men out of the ship to Rakian soil. The current plan was for Teg and his men to serve as distraction while Burzmali and the other essential crew make their escape from Rakis. A long time passed since this event. Odrade is in her office as Reverend Mother Superior at Planet's chapter house. Duncan, being visible by the Oracle, was stuck to remaining inside the no-ship so that no honored Matre may discover the location of Planet's chapter house. The guild navigators could see Duncan, and they were, by now, all the slaves of the honored Matres. The guild, being slaves of the honored Matres and without melange, would have not much time left to live before all the steersmen were gone. All of the Sisterhood's main functions were transferred from Valak 9 to Chapter House a long time ago, and there they would remain until this threat of the honored Matres was taken care of. The Reverend Mother Superior's office had a bust of Sister Chinoe, the only sister who managed to get close to the tyrant. Dar and Tar had become a single person. Taraza's plan was far too risky and they had far too little time. The Tleilax had a security breach through the returned ones from the scattering, who served in truth the honored Matres. They gave away intelligence which helped the Matres in attacking Gammu and Rakis. Ix had no way to compete with the technological innovations coming from the scattering. They would soon crumble as well, just as the fish speakers in Ix were far too irrelevant and would also succumb. Rakis had been destroyed. Although the book describes that its surface was burned and the planet became a dead rock of fire and ashes, I personally like to imagine that the planet became a bunch of rocks and dust in space. The Bene Tleilax, after they discovered the treachery from the returned ones, had completely succumbed to the honored Matres. Waff was killed by his own face dancers, who became slaves of the Matres. Since Sheeana had Siona's mark, she could leave the no-ship, and a genetic exam of Duncan was conducted. It so seems that he was an amalgamation of every previous dead Duncan Gola, all those cells combined with the original into a single body. Murbella was pregnant, it seems, and she was tied to Duncan, just as Duncan was tied to her. They were slaves of each other. That sandworm was still inside the no-ship's cargo. It would soon go through a metamorphosis and become Sandshrouds once more. Chapter House was set to become a new Rakis and produce spice melange for the Sisterhood, while they lived off the huge stash Odrade had found in Sietch Tabr. The Bene Gesserit Council concluded that Miles' genetics, along with his Bene Gesserit and Mentat training, led him to acquiring some sort of prescience powers, able to see through no ships, no rooms, and possibly Siona's mark. That idea was very scary, and a man like that would be very dangerous. The breeding sector would have to study that subject further. It's interesting to see how Paul also had Bene Gesserit and Mentat training and became the Kvisets Hadrach. Paul Atreides and Miles Teg went through the same transformation. But the T-probe did something to Miles we cannot fully understand. It was too different from the spice agony Paul went through. Odrade came to talk to Duncan. She revealed how Miles Teg was her father, also how the other Bene Gesserit wanted Duncan dead, but she prohibited his execution for the love she feels from her past memories. Odrade told Duncan that Taraza's plan was to use Duncan so that the honored Matres would destroy Rakis. And by doing that, the Sisterhood finally freed the universe from the influence of the Tyrant, which still held control over everything. Now, with Rakis destroyed, humanity was free from the Tyrant's vision. Was this really the result of the Golden Path? Or was it still ongoing? That single sandworm in the no-ship's cargo had only a small fraction of his memory, not enough to hold his influence over the universe. And once Chapterhouse became a new Dune, humanity would have far surpassed the Tyrant's irrelevant influence. Personally, I think both this and the next novel are very underrated. I very much love what Frank did here with Heretics and further developed with Chapterhouse. It is a shame that he never got to finish the work. Otherwise, I might have even considered the second trilogy to be better and more interesting than the first one. I know that for someone who's reading this book for the first time, this is gonna be very confusing and complicated to keep track of. I myself, when I read the first time, I didn't like it very much, but found it interesting, and now reading to make this video, I pretty much loved the work, and I think this is peak sci-fi. It just is. It is an incredible piece of work by itself, both of these last two books. It is just when you compare them to the original trilogy and God Emperor that they feel inferior, you could say. But it is what I just said. Had the 7th book been written and released, I'm pretty much confident to say that I would have preferred the second trilogy much better than the first one. Some other things I would like to mention is how ChatGPT is basically described here, when young Duncan is studying in the library. That portion was so funny to read. And no, this script isn't written by ChatGPT, because I'm a writer myself, you know. I have brains, I know how to write. I'm not a mindless slig who needs to use AI to write the simplest of texts. Another huge part of this video, and one more thing to the list of correct predictions Frank made of the future, is the whole idea of the honored Matres, women who control men with sex and sex alone, to do all their bidding. Isn't this what we see today with OnlyFans and such? Armies of slaves rotting their brains all because of their desire of these dominatrixes. Just like how the honored Matres are. Well, with all that said, this has been my video. Hope you enjoyed the full story of Heretics of Dune. Make sure to check out my videos on the full story of Children of Dune and God Emperor of Dune. And subscribe for more content. Don't forget to leave a comment. Until the next time.